In this section, I want to add one complication to that climate and conflict discussion that I was talking about in the last video, and that is natural resources. There has been a long history of humans battling each other over the control of resources, going back to the American Revolution, talking about trade routes and commodity exports, the Civil War, also in the U.S., cotton, other agricultural commodities, and the slave labor that made that kind of resource extraction possible. The Chile-Bolivia War of the Pacific was about nitrates that lost Bolivia's access to the coast, which we're going to be talking about later on in the term. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait back in 1990 was related to oil production, getting at that initial discussion back in week one. Liberia about timber, Sierra Leone, alluvial diamonds, which you didn't really need any heavy machinery to get. Cote d'Ivoire, cocoa, one of the major exports of that country, can be a crucial resource and source of revenue for taxation, like Paul Collier was talking about how important that was as a driver of conflict as well. And in the South China Sea, which we haven't really heard that much about lately, with the focus on Ukraine and with Taiwan on the other side of the world, the South China Sea and the jockeying for power by the major power, China, as well as other regional powers, is often quite closely tied to oil exploration and production. And I think we're going to keep coming back to the importance of non-renewable resources as a driver for conflict in this class. And I think what is it about these kind of non-renewable resources that are most likely to lead to conflict? And I think I can think of a couple of direct reasons that non-renewable resources are quite easily converted into state power, like with the Venezuelan case we're going to look at in a second. When you have those natural resources, your country becomes strategically important as well as economically important, and those exports can lead to quite sizable economic resources for the government to be able to redistribute either to the people in control and those that support them, or to buy weapons or mercenaries, or to be able to spend on citizens within their country. The country relies less on taxing the general population, but just as long as they control the resource, they can control the revenue that generates, and it can be more easily converted to state power. And the other relationship that is more of a kind of like the democratic piece, one that's an observed correlation, is that states that are more dependent on non-renewable resources are often poorer and have less developed economic characteristics in the gross domestic product, that often a country that has a resource can depend overwhelmingly on that resource and don't try to diversify their economy away from it, and they can end up being poor on a per capita basis. However, there are renewable resources that are going to be increasingly important in the world. I mentioned solar power earlier today, but then also this made me think of I think it was Homer Dixon briefly mentioned the strategic importance of the Manantali Dam in Mali, and this is a map that kind of shows you how this one dam ended up creating this huge lake behind it and controlled the outflow of water to both Mali itself as well as to neighboring countries. And this is a dam from the ground. I think the reading talked about it a bit, but there's a lot of echoes to destabilization and moving people off the land with a Three Gorges Dam in China when I was there a couple of decades ago. Large infrastructure projects like dams are also been contentious in Chile and a number of other countries. This dam might not look out of place in a lot of other places around the world. We're going to be talking about another dam in Ethiopia in a couple of weeks, actually, but it required about 10,000 people to be displaced in the area that was going to be flooded once the dam was completed. Even more were caught with population displacements across the borders. There were ethnic clashes that occurred, as well as clashes by livelihoods between herders and agriculturalists, something we're also going to be seeing on the other side of the Sahel in Ethiopia and Kenya in a few weeks. It cost over €1 billion to build, and most of the funding, like with these large projects, like with the Ethiopian Dam, we're going to be focusing on in a few weeks, are largely internationally funded. But by and large, it has been successful in generating energy as well as energy that's been sent abroad. According to a source that I was able to find, in 2006, about 90% of all Mali's electricity was generated by this one dam. Mauritania, over a third, 34% of their energy production came from this one dam, and in Senegal, 13%. Larger and more developed country. But I think it shows the tensions that can be derived at the group level, by far below the state level, but with herders and agriculturalists, displaced groups that were moved towards other territories, are often actually sent to or called Senegalese instead of being from Mali, and were forced abroad. These kind of infrastructure projects can be crucial for development. It can be crucial as generating a resource that citizens within a country need, but it can also lead to tensions. And it's not one that's talked about as much as these other kind of larger projects. But I wanted to stress with this example that you have these incredibly high-profile, extreme values of dams like the one we're going to see in Ethiopia, or natural disasters, resources that are non-renewable like oil, but similar kind of concerns and displacements and tensions can also be creatively applied to our understanding of renewable resource tensions and potential conflict. This is an article from the 80s that I found that talked about that, and there was worry that it would escalate to a broader conflict. And these kind of tensions about infrastructure spending and the economic implications of it and how certain people will benefit more than others is not unique to developing countries by any means. In trying to bring it back again to Canberra and the experiences that my students you might be able to relate to, or to me, it reminded me of the discussions about the Canberra Light Rail, dating back now well before your time in 2016. Expectations was that the light rail would drive up property values, something that's happened in a large number of other contexts. They thought it would happen in Canberra, and lo and behold, it has, right? Even since I've lived in Canberra in 2015, the Northbourne corridor has completely changed. The affordable housing and the people that used to be able to live there has basically been driven away and hasn't been adequately replaced, according to certain sources. And so you have this kind of economic displacement that benefits certain segments of society, that there is some potential cost to that. So how can we develop coping strategies to enable those kind of developments, to be able to meet the needs of people within the state? You can continue to rely on a particular resource, but compensate those that have limited access to that resource or affected by the displacement from it. Shift economies away from the resources that are being depleted. You see this in Abu Dhabi and other Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, that are trying to diversify away from the dependency on oil, because in a couple of different instances by mid-century, there are estimates that the oil reserves will have largely run dry by then. And so by diversifying your economy, by investing the money now to diversify the economy later, you can mitigate the hardships on your citizens when those resources and the revenues from them decline. However, both of these strategies of compensating the losers from resource development, as well as diversifying away, requires government resources and planning. And in the Chinese case, it's an unparalleled kind of organizational challenge at a national level with a population of 1 billion people. Other countries, writ smaller, it does require resources and a longer shadow of the future to make these kind of plans. How can we link more generally climate change to conflict and kind of connect to those resources and the other readings that we covered for this week? The first is that climate change is a threat multiplier for instability, that it has an interactive effect in making other things, like I mentioned earlier, economic instability or political instability worse. However, there isn't really evidence for that direct arrow that I showed in the graph in week 1 from environmental degradation to conflict, that there isn't, it's not necessarily a necessary condition or a sufficient condition. For conflict, it's a more conditional effect that requires connections to other factors that we're going to be talking about in the next section of the class. As Saleyhan said over a decade ago, resource scarcity, natural disasters, and long-term climatic shifts are ubiquitous, where armed conflict is rare. Therefore, environmental conditions by themselves cannot predict violent outbreaks. I think that and the updated JPR reading for this week by von Uxel and Buhaug stress this as well, that these factors are background conditions. They interact with the political world, and that's why we need to understand, as I mentioned in the first video, the political decisions and the political actions of leaders and the opportunities by those leaders not making adequate actions can actually lead to violence. Saleyhan includes a couple of areas for research improvement, which hopefully should connect with students' interest in writing literature reviews, that by summarizing literature, coming up with a couple of specific themes, you see what still are weaknesses of literature and what can be done in the future. Saleyhan, I think, makes a couple of points that von Uxel and Buhaug pick up as well. Develop better measures of political institutions. Last week we talked about how the polity and varieties of democracy and just general conceptions of democracy can be different depending on whether you focus on just the basis of elections or more liberal democratic conceptualizations of democracy. So what is it about political institutions? Like Saleyhan talks about the judicial system, like we talked about last week. Second suggestion is develop exogenous measures of environmental stress, things that can't be manipulated by humans, like those rising temperatures that we talked about in the Miguel et al. Piece a couple of weeks ago, and model endogenous relationships between environmental pressures and political failures. Hopefully you should see by now a recurring theme about the challenges in trying to tell a theoretical story. The major challenges are making sure that you really have you have theoretical and empirical confidence that the thing you're trying to shape the outcome, in this case conflict, the direction is going one direction instead of potentially the other direction, and whether you can find something else outside those two things that that will give you more confidence that the relationship is what you theorize. And then more difficult is to model those conditional interactive effects that Homer Dixon talks about, that we're going to see over and over again in the next part of the class, that the climate and other structural background conditions don't vary that much, but conflict can break out quite suddenly in certain areas. And so how is it that the background structural conditions can shape agents or individuals' interests and their likelihood to take that risk to start a war to try to control the resources themselves? couple of other factors briefly from a former reading that I booted out to add the Von Uxel and Buhaug article, also from over at Buhaug. Two additional factors in shaping the probability of conflict, and that's the environmental and social costs of resource extraction. We're going to be touching on that briefly in a couple of cases later on in the term, but I think it's important to note the costs of resource extraction for oil. I think it's clear, but for the minerals that go into our mobile phones, like lithium, often countries that are politically unstable, like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Mali, can be sources, important sources for those kind of minerals. And then also going back to that the fields, the burning oil fields in Kuwait in 1991, then environmental costs of conflict. There is a lot of interesting research that could be done on these topics, but I think most people are focused, as this class does, is just that first simple story of how does environmental factors lead directly and indirectly into conflict instead of potentially what effect conflict has. And I think for research papers, that could be also something to think about, to look at making a contribution. So, yeah, moving on. So we've talked about the Homer-Dixon paper for this week. We talked a bit about the Saleyhan piece. We'll be focusing more on those in the workshop as well. The next piece I wanted to mention was the Hassang et al. From 2013. If you can think of any kind of links between climate and conflict, they've probably tested it. In this class, I've tried to have a wide variety of readings, literature reviews, both as a way to have a non-technical summarizing of the theoretical approaches to understanding the topics we're focusing on, to the other extreme with the cutting-edge quantitative models. And a lot of the things they've done a decade ago now in the Hassang paper, it just really impresses me in the amount of work that they put into this incredibly influential piece. A lot of people have raised a lot of questions about what they did empirically and the comparisons of very different kinds of outcomes across very different time periods into one paper. Nevertheless, it's an interesting way of trying to generalize these arguments and effects of climate factors on conflict and a number of other different kind of violent outcomes, including some I had never thought to include in the similar kind of study. And I think this is the list of the articles that they read and they took the models from. I think what's more influential and what people have focused on more recently is just the fact that as temperatures increased, the probability of local violence, of civil war violence, in both sub-Saharan Africa and in the tropics increased. So they found, in looking at a whole bunch of different studies and a whole bunch of different geographic levels, that as the temperature rises, and I showed you how those temperature anomalies are becoming more common, both in Canberra, in the Middle East, and in other places around the world, that historically has led to an increased probability of different forms of violence, according to Hassang. And it's also likely, as we saw with that video in the beginning of today, with the growing temperature anomalies happening around the world, that this holds some really dire implications for the probability of conflict increasing in a number of different regions around the world. And here's a map from the Hassang et al. Paper. I always try to use visuals when I can because I think it's a more direct way of trying to show the story. You see the estimates of the temperature changes around the world in 2050, which is now 30 years away. Hopefully I'll be able to see the non-dire predictions that I'm around in 2050, just in general, but then also to see the less dire predictions. But you see in Australia, there are those kind of red changes along the coast, but nowhere near as dark as huge swaths of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So you see different regions, Canada less directly affected, Australia less directly affected. A lot of those developing countries that don't have the same kind of governmental capacity that I talked about earlier are likely to see those effects. Of course, this is extrapolation from previous trends and what's likely to happen in the future. But as I said earlier, a lot of the more dramatic predictions made 20 or 30 years ago were actually underestimates for how fast these kind of effects are actually happening. So we'll see if I'm still teaching this in 10 years, whether the predictions have changed, let alone in 20. One study that they mentioned that I just wanted to draw your attention to try to show you how you could take similar environmental factors and apply it to different outcomes as a potential topic that could be of interest for you for your own research, is this paper going back to 1986, looking at how you're more likely to honk your horn when you're driving your car as it gets hotter outside. Of course, this was in the 1980s in Arizona when air conditioners in cars were less common. But I do think the relationship is both statistically significant as well as substantively interesting and significant, that there was a linear increase in horn honking with an increased temperature, and those results are even more dramatic for people who had their windows rolled down. And you just look at the graph here, it's just it blows my mind that this is a creative study. People went out in the field and they just sat there and they monitored the temperature, and they monitored the number of horn honks they heard. And it's just one of those creative studies that might not get the same amount of attention as some of the other more dramatic forms of violence, but there's evidence that homicides increase, and Hussain et al. Talks about this, that homicides increase in warmer temperatures and that people become more frustrated. I know with those 40-degree temperature days here in Australia, my daughter was born in 2017. Our air conditioners went out shortly after she came home, and there was a number of days that were in the 40 degrees, and it was too hot to be at home. We ended up staying at a hotel for a week, and I know I was frustrated. I don't think I would go to so far as to use violence. I don't know if I honked my horn, but it kind of shows those relationships that can affect people at an individual level, decisions to honk horns, but that these aggregate indicators can have a group level or national level effect as well. So that is my way of kind of saying and trying to connect climate, resources, and conflict. There are a whole lot of different questions that you can ask, a whole lot of potential relationships between how climate shapes resource extraction, how resource extraction leads to conflict, and how those things are all connected. And in the Venezuelan case study, I think in a similar way to the Turkmenistan case, it is a case in which a couple of years ago, when things were really dire, there was widespread talk of civil war risk that has kind of abated in recent years. But I wanted to mention a couple of specific connections between natural resource extraction that I've talked about, geography, and the human security costs of a dependence on natural resource extraction, and how that could connect to the human security leading to political instability. So let's take a break now, and I'll talk a bit about the Venezuelan case and leave you with 2 videos about that specific case that we'll talk about more in the workshop.